nearly 497 billion CFA francs in just 3 years. That is roughly 877 million United States dollars at recent exchange rates. For a country facing a severe security crisis, that number deserves attention. But before we go any further, there is something important you need to know. This is not 497 billion CFA francs given to Ibrahim Traore by the African diaspora. It is not 497 billion CFA francs invested in factories either. The real story is more interesting. Between 2023 and 2025, Burkina Faso mobilized nearly 497 billion CFA francs through its Patriotic Support Fund. The money came from multiple sources across Burkinabe society and was primarily created to support the country's security effort. At the same time, another financial current has been flowing into Burkina Faso. Burkinabe citizens living abroad have been sending home more than 200 billion CFA francs annually through official channels. That is roughly 353 million United States dollars. Now, consider what these two figures reveal. One shows that Burkina Faso has demonstrated an ability to mobilize substantial resources internally when the nation considers something an urgent priority. The other shows that its diaspora already represents a significant financial force. And Ibrahim Traore appears to be asking a much bigger question. What if Africa's diaspora could contribute not only money for families, but also investment capital, scientific knowledge, engineering experience, medical expertise, business networks, and technology? What if returning home did not necessarily mean abandoning a life in America, Europe, or the Caribbean, but instead meant reconnecting African knowledge and African capital with African development? That is where this story becomes larger than Burkina Faso. It becomes a test of self-reliance, sovereignty, and Pan-African cooperation. And if you want to follow the changes shaping Africa through evidence rather than slogans, subscribe and stay with us. Because we are going to follow the money, examine Ibrahim Traore's strategy, separate documented facts from political mythology, and ask the question that matters most. Can Africans at home and abroad turn solidarity into lasting economic power? To understand why nearly 497 billion CFA francs matters, we first need to understand what the Patriotic Support Fund actually is. Burkina Faso created the fund in 2023 as the country confronted a severe security crisis. Its immediate purpose was not industrialization. It was designed primarily to help finance the national security effort, including support for the volunteers for the defense of the homeland, equipment, fuel, and other needs connected to the fight against armed groups. Over the 3 years from 2023 through 2025, the mechanism mobilized exactly 496 billion, 966 million, 246,105 CFA francs. That is an extraordinary amount, but there is an important distinction. The money did not come from one source. The system brought together voluntary contributions from citizens, organizations, businesses, members of the diaspora, and other sources. It also incorporated special contribution mechanisms linked to selected goods and services. So when you hear someone say that ordinary citizens voluntarily handed Ibrahim Traore nearly 497 billion CFA francs, be careful. That description oversimplifies what actually happened. And when someone claims the entire amount came from the diaspora, that is also incorrect. The significance lies somewhere else. Burkina Faso developed a mechanism capable of gathering substantial domestic resources around what the government presented as an urgent national priority. Think about what that means. For decades, many African governments have faced a familiar question whenever a major crisis or development project appears. Where will the external financing come from? Burkina Faso is experimenting with another question. How much can we mobilize ourselves? That does not mean foreign financing suddenly becomes unnecessary. Burkina Faso still participates in international trade, works with international financial institutions, and needs outside technology, investment, and partnerships. Self-reliance is not isolation. The more meaningful idea is increasing the share of national priorities that Africans themselves can finance and influence. The Patriotic Support Fund has demonstrated that significant domestic mobilization is possible during an emergency. The harder question comes next. If Burkina Faso can mobilize hundreds of billions of CFA francs for national security, can that same spirit eventually help finance electricity, agriculture, factories, infrastructure, and productive jobs? That question leads directly to the diaspora. Now look beyond the Patriotic Support Fund, because another stream of money tells us something important about Burkina Faso's relationship with its people abroad. Burkinabe citizens living outside the country send home more than 200 billion CFA francs each year through official channels. At recent exchange rates, that is roughly 353 million United States dollars annually. But this figure must not be confused with diaspora contributions to the Patriotic Support Fund. According to government reporting for 2025, the diaspora contributed nearly 494 million CFA francs directly to that fund during the year. So we are dealing with three different numbers. Nearly 497 billion CFA francs represents the entire Patriotic Support Fund mobilized from multiple sources between 2023 and 2025. More than 200 billion CFA francs represents annual money transfers from Burkinabe citizens abroad through official channels. And nearly 494 million CFA francs represents diaspora contributions directly to the Patriotic Support Fund in 2025. Keeping those numbers separate matters because the larger story is not about exaggerating how much the diaspora gave Ibrahim Traore. It is about recognizing how much economic potential already exists outside Burkina Faso's borders. Traditionally, remittances help families pay for food, housing, medical care, education, and daily necessities. Those contributions are enormously important. They can protect households during difficult times and give children opportunities their parents never had. But imagine taking the next step. What if a portion of diaspora savings could also finance agricultural processing, energy projects, transportation, manufacturing, or growing businesses? Then the relationship begins to change. The diaspora is no longer viewed only as a source of family support. It becomes a potential source of productive capital. And contribution does not require everyone to permanently move back to Burkina Faso. A retired professional in America could invest. An entrepreneur in the Caribbean could build business connections. An engineer in Europe could transfer technical knowledge while continuing to live abroad. This is the deeper opportunity Ibrahim Traore's government is trying to explore. The question is no longer simply how much money Africans abroad send home. The more important question is how much African capital, knowledge, and experience can be organized to create productive capacity at home. So, how do you turn patriotic feeling and diaspora savings into actual investment? Burkina Faso is beginning to experiment with financial tools designed to answer that question. One part of this effort is the Diaspora One-Stop Shop, created to give Burkinabe citizens abroad a clearer entry point for information, business creation, investment opportunities, and administrative support. That matters because asking people to invest is easy. Giving them a system they can understand and trust is much harder. Then came a more ambitious step. On the 6th of May 2026, Burkina Faso launched the first operation of its patriotic borrowing program, commonly associated with diaspora bonds. The initial fundraising target was 125 billion CFA francs, roughly 220 million United States dollars at recent exchange rates. The response exceeded that target. Approximately 151.5 billion CFA francs was mobilized, reaching about 121% of the original objective. But once again, we need to separate an inspiring story from an exaggerated one. It would be misleading to say that the entire 151.5 billion CFA francs came exclusively from Burkinabe citizens living abroad. The operation also reached investors within the wider regional financial market. That distinction does not weaken the story. It helps us understand what Burkina Faso is actually building. The Patriotic Support Fund was largely about national contribution during an emergency. A bond works differently. People provide capital with defined financial conditions, and the state assumes an obligation to repay investors. That turns patriotic participation into something closer to structured investment. The broader financing program has been presented with an overall ambition of about 240 billion CFA francs, and this creates both an opportunity and a responsibility. If citizens and investors are being asked to put their savings behind national development, enthusiasm alone will not be enough. They need transparency. They need to understand where the money goes, what projects it finances, and how repayment will be protected. Trust may bring the first investment. Performance determines whether people invest again. That is why the next stage of Burkina Faso's experiment matters even more than the fundraising total. The real measure of success is what those billions of CFA francs eventually become. Money by itself does not create sovereignty. What matters is what that money eventually produces. This is where Burkina Faso's experiment becomes more practical. After the first patriotic borrowing operation, about 85 billion CFA francs, roughly 150 million United States dollars, was allocated through financing agreements connected with selected companies and development projects. The larger strategy points towards sectors such as agriculture, agricultural processing, fertilizer, energy, roads, waste management, housing, and industry. Consider agriculture first. A large share of Burkina Faso's population depends on farming for its livelihood, but growing crops is only one part of the economic chain. When raw agricultural products leave the farm without being processed locally, much of the additional value can be created somewhere else. Processing changes that equation. A locally processed crop can support factories, packaging businesses, transportation companies, storage facilities, technicians, and additional jobs before the finished product ever reaches a consumer. The same logic applies to fertilizer. If farmers depend heavily on imported agricultural inputs, disruptions abroad can quickly become problems at home. Building more domestic capacity can reduce that vulnerability. Then there is energy. Industrial ambition means very little without reliable electricity. Burkina Faso has historically depended significantly on imported electricity, making energy security an important part of any serious effort to expand manufacturing and processing. This is why self-reliance should not be confused with the idea that Burkina Faso must produce absolutely everything by itself. No modern economy works that way. The real objective is to increase the country's ability to produce more of what it needs, process more of what it grows and extracts, finance more of its priorities, and negotiate with outside partners from a stronger position. That is the test these investments will eventually face. A billion CFA francs raised is impressive, but a billion CFA francs productively invested is far more important. If these financing mechanisms produce reliable energy, productive factories, stronger agriculture, better infrastructure, and sustainable businesses, they can expand Burkina Faso's economic capacity. And building that capacity requires something money alone cannot buy. It requires people with the knowledge to make these projects work. And this may be the most valuable resource Burkina Faso can bring home. Not money, but knowledge. Ibrahim Traore has repeatedly appealed to engineers, doctors, scientists, entrepreneurs, and other professionals in the diaspora to participate in the country's development. The idea is larger than asking successful Burkinabe citizens abroad to simply send another payment home. A country can purchase machinery, but someone must know how to operate it, maintain it, improve it, and eventually build something better. A country can finance a factory, but experienced managers, engineers, technicians, accountants, and entrepreneurs are needed to keep that factory productive. This is where the diaspora can provide at least 4 forms of capital. The first is financial capital through savings and investment. The second is human capital through professional knowledge and technical skills. The third is networks. Africans living abroad may have relationships with universities, businesses, suppliers, investors, hospitals, and technology companies that would otherwise be difficult to reach. The fourth is practical experience gained from working inside mature institutions and competitive industries. And returning does not have to mean packing every possession and permanently leaving America, Europe, or the Caribbean. Imagine a Burkinabe engineer living in Atlanta who spends part of each year training young technicians in Ouagadougou. Imagine a physician abroad helping a hospital improve procedures while continuing to practice overseas. Or consider an entrepreneur who connects a Burkinabe processing company with equipment suppliers and customers in another market. That is not simply reversing brain drain. It is creating brain circulation. Knowledge can move back and forth. Capital can move with it. Business relationships can cross borders while families continue living where they choose. This gives the idea of returning home a much broader meaning. For Africa, return can mean the return of investment. It can mean the return of knowledge. It can mean the return of professional networks and confidence. And that may explain why Traore's message is beginning to reach beyond Burkinabe citizens abroad. Because the next stage of this story involves hundreds of people whose connection to Burkina Faso is not based primarily on citizenship. Their connection is to Africa itself. That broader connection became visible in late 2025 when more than 700 Afro-descendants and members of the African diaspora traveled to Burkina Faso. They were not simply 700 Burkinabe citizens returning from abroad. That distinction matters. Many represented the wider African diaspora, including people whose connection to the continent reaches across generations and across the Atlantic. Their journey therefore carried a meaning larger than ordinary tourism. When Ibrahim Traore met them, his message was simple but politically significant. He welcomed them home, encouraged them to return, called on them to invest, and described them as potential ambassadors who could tell others what they had personally experienced in Burkina Faso. The government has also been taking steps that could make this relationship more practical. Burkina Faso has promoted visa-free entry for African travelers. New rules have established a framework for permanent residence, and during his meeting with Afro-descendants, Traore announced the removal of certain financial requirements connected with obtaining permanent residence for them. These measures should not be exaggerated into a promise that every person of African descent can automatically settle in Burkina Faso without conditions, but they reveal the direction of the policy. The message is moving from welcome home toward a more practical question. What would allow you to stay, invest, work, and participate? This is where Pan-Africanism begins to move beyond speeches. Imagine the sequence. First, people visit. Then some establish deeper connections. Some may invest. Others may bring professional skills, business networks, or communication platforms. And those people can then tell Africa's story to communities abroad from their own experience. Traore has emphasized that Africans must strengthen their ability to tell their own story rather than allowing outsiders to define the continent for them. In that sense, diaspora engagement becomes more than an economic strategy. It becomes part of a struggle over identity, confidence, and who gets to describe Africa to the world. Burkina Faso is therefore experimenting with a much larger definition of home. Not only a home for Burkinabe citizens abroad, but potentially a meeting point for people across the African world. And that raises an unavoidable question. How much of this transformation should actually be credited to Ibrahim Traore himself? The answer requires separating leadership from mythology. Ibrahim Traore did not personally create every CFA franc mobilized by Burkina Faso, and every factory, investment program, or government initiative cannot reasonably be credited to one man, but his political influence on the direction of this experiment is difficult to ignore. First, Traore has placed sovereignty and domestic mobilization near the center of his political message. Under his leadership, raising resources inside Burkina Faso has been presented as more than a financial necessity. It has become part of a broader argument about national dignity and the ability to determine national priorities. Second, Traore has helped turn diaspora participation into a political mission. His message is not simply to send money home. He is asking Africans abroad to bring capital, knowledge, professional experience, networks, and confidence into the development process. Third, he connects this strategy to Pan-Africanism. For Traore, greater African unity is connected with freer movement, economic cooperation, cultural confidence, and stronger political sovereignty. His government has also revived institutions associated with the sovereignty-focused legacy of Thomas Sankara. That does not make Traore a new Thomas Sankara. History will make its own judgment. His most important wager may be much simpler. The more financing, skills, and productive capacity Africans can organize for themselves, the greater their ability to negotiate with the rest of the world on their own terms. That message has helped make Traore an influential symbol among sections of Africa's Pan-African movement and diaspora. But popularity is not the same thing as policy success. The real test will not be applause, social media videos, or the size of crowds welcoming him. It will be whether these policies produce stronger agriculture, reliable energy, functioning industries, sustainable employment, improved incomes, greater security, manageable debt, and institutions that can survive beyond one leader. That final point may be the most important. If Burkina Faso's new financial and development mechanisms depend entirely on Ibrahim Traore, they remain fragile. If they eventually function, regardless of who occupies the presidency, Burkina Faso will have built something much more powerful than personal popularity. It will have built institutions. And that distinction becomes essential when we examine how the outside world is responding. So, is the West really afraid of Burkina Faso's experiment? There is no reliable evidence that Western governments oppose Burkina Faso simply because it mobilized nearly 497 billion CFA francs. The real relationship is far more complicated. Tensions with France have grown dramatically under Ibrahim Traore. In June 2026, Burkina Faso and France severed diplomatic relations after years of disputes involving sovereignty, security, foreign influence, and accusations of interference. European institutions have also criticized Burkina Faso over restrictions on civic space, human rights concerns, and its growing relationship with Russia. Those criticisms should be examined seriously rather than automatically dismissed as hostility toward African sovereignty. At the same time, we should not pretend that international politics is free from competing interests. A Burkina Faso that controls more of its financing, resources, and strategic decisions can change the influence traditionally exercised by outside partners. But there is another fact that complicates the popular narrative. The International Monetary Fund continued working with and providing financing to Burkina Faso in 2026, while calling for stronger transparency and governance. So the West is not one single actor following one single strategy. We should also be careful with dramatic claims circulating online. After Burkina Faso broke relations with France, a viral video supposedly showing Emmanuel Macron threatening the country was found to contain artificially manipulated audio. That lesson matters. Supporting African sovereignty should never require believing every story that confirms what we already want to believe. Burkina Faso deserves serious examination precisely because the experiment is real. And the strongest case for African self-reliance will ultimately come from measurable results, not misinformation about its opponents. So what can the rest of Africa learn from Burkina Faso? The first lesson is that the diaspora should be viewed as more than a source of remittances. Africans living abroad possess capital, skills, professional experience, technology connections, and business networks. Bringing even part of those resources into productive investment could create opportunities that family transfers alone cannot. The second lesson is that patriotism must eventually become institution. People may contribute because they trust Ibrahim Traore today, but what happens tomorrow when another leader occupies the presidency? A durable system needs transparent accounts, enforceable contracts, independent oversight, clear investment rules, and institutions that continue functioning regardless of who governs, trust can mobilize the first investment. Transparency determines whether there will be a second. The third lesson is that self-reliance does not mean isolation. Africa still needs international trade, technology, investment, and partnerships. The objective should be greater bargaining power so African nations can cooperate with the world without surrendering their ability to choose their own priorities. And money must ultimately create productive capacity. A bond is still debt. It must be repaid. If borrowed capital produces electricity, roads, fertilizer, processing plants, productive businesses, and jobs, it can strengthen the economy that must repay it. If the money is poorly managed, sovereignty financing can become another financial burden. That is why Burkina Faso should not yet be presented as a finished success story. Nearly 497 billion CFA francs does not make Burkina Faso a superpower. It does not prove that every decision made by Ibrahim Traore is correct, but it does prove that an important experiment is underway. And that experiment matters beyond Burkina Faso. Mali under Assimi Goïta and Niger under Abdurrahman Etiani are also participating in a wider sovereignty debate across the Sahel. France is confronting a very different relationship with its former partners. West Africa is being forced to reconsider old political and economic arrangements, while the African Union faces the larger question of what meaningful continental integration should look like. This is where Pan-African power becomes more than a slogan. The real question behind today's Africa news is whether African money, African knowledge, and African institutions can increasingly work together for African development. Burkina Faso has not given us the final answer. It has given us a test worth watching. And if you are part of the African diaspora, ask yourself one question. What would you need to see before you were willing to invest your money, knowledge, or time in Africa? Share your answer with us. And follow this channel as we continue examining the forces reshaping Africa. Because the future of Pan-African cooperation will be measured not only by speeches, but by what Africans actually build together. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.